Thank you again for joining us today in the Resilience Journal in this important conversation. Again, I've been looking forward to having this talk with you, given the positioning that ASAP has, very unique and potentially powerful in terms of moving the industry forward. And so the first thing I wanted to just throw out, I'm just looking at some notes here. I have a list of 25 or so segments that compose what we can call the adaptation space or business or industry or right. So you have weather forecasters and meteorologists, you have scientists, academic researchers, you have risk managers, both in the public and private sectors, and the mapping folks and the modeling folks and the AI folks, and you have organizational design and culture, again, both in public and private sector, emergency management services, first responders, relief agencies, NGOs, public health, property restoration, legal services, financial services, insurance, food chain security solutions, logistics, infrastructure recovery, all kinds of folks involved in that, reconstruction contractors, natural capital solutions and organizations, urban and city planners, smart city technologists, redevelopment companies, people and community networking and connection services, displacement and migration services, and that kind of overlays or overlaps with the 16 verticals or sectors, I think they call it, the Homeland Security Department, at least in the U.S. I believe it's 10 in Canada, 8 in the EU. But the Homeland Security Department lists chemicals as critical infrastructure, critical sectors. Chemicals, critical manufacturing, large crowd commercial and entertainment facilities like stadiums and malls, financial services, food and agriculture, healthcare facilities, government facilities, defense industry, emergency services, transportation, communications installations, information technology services, energy, nuclear reactors, materials and waste, water and dams. Those are the 16 sectors that kind of overlap the 25 segments, and it all falls under climate adaptation. And here you are at ASAP, at the American Society of Adaptation Professionals. Mm-hmm. So how do you see the space? How do you kind of tackle it, envision it, approach it?
Yeah, I think that you're right that the adaptation space has the potential of seeming incredibly messy and perhaps too disparate to be an actual thing. But when we think about climate change adaptation, and specifically people who are climate adaptation professionals, they tend to be somebody who has gone partway into their career and are recognizing now that they cannot keep doing the work in the same way that they have in the past, that the status quo isn't sufficient, and the impacts of climate change are already changing how they have to conduct their business, do their job, work every day, and the impacts will continue modifying and changing the way that they have to perform in their jobs. And by that recognition, and then by learning how they need to be adopting new procedures, processes, standards, they become an adaptation professional. It is a composite of all of those things that you listed. And part of the essence of being an adaptation professional is that you start to see how your work is integrated and part of a broader system of professionals where you're working collaboratively in a systems thinking approach. So those are the kind of the pieces, the recognition that the status quo is no longer going to hold, and that the siloed, go-it-alone way of a single profession is also insufficient, is where you see borne out the adaptation professional field.
Yeah, but it's so interdisciplinary, so multi-sectorial, so rich in variety and diversity of fields and professions to bring all of that together. And for one, let's say somebody in food security to sort of connect with some research organization and then connect with any one of these other fields, right? I mean, it's a great mission to have from your perspective.
It is.
To kind of like bring all these divergent people together somehow. in a
Yeah.
platform.
So our success is really measured on being able to have a network that is both broad and deep. So having people that come from food systems, from national security, from community development, and you know, natural system management, to be able to recognize how they are all having to find the same good science data that will inform us about where we are now and where we're going. That integration of climate information into your decision making process tends to look very similar, actually, across multiple disciplines. And in fact, the way that the climate impacts are altering our natural systems, our urban systems, the way that we think about our water security, whether that's too much water, not enough water, too much water when you need it. What is it? Not enough water when you need it, too much when you don't.
Right.
That tends to lead into these natural overlaps with other fields. And so we find that broad community of people who are thinking about adaptation really find it easy to come together because they're facing the same challenge and they're ever more running into each other as they try to get to solutions. On the other hand, we also know that ASAP is an organization that is best serving its members when we have a deep membership of people who are arborists, emergency planners, a stormwater engineer, so that folks can find people who are like them and that they can really learn from each other's more sector specific experience. Part of the manifestation of ASAP has been that people who were doing maybe sustainability related work or eco conservation work or some other field just kept running into one another and saying, this conference isn't quite talking about what I'm thinking of in climate change. And slowly, this community of people who were adapting formed themselves up. And they, I think, will continue to grow. The community of people who are seeking colleagues and like-minded folks from across this range of disciplines is going to continue growing. At least for I see this as a growth field for the next probably 10 years. I do think that there's a future where individual sectors do a better job of supporting their kind of traditional members by providing the adaptation and the climate information and knowledge that's needed. But we're not there yet. So ASAP is really kind of filling a gap, saying that we know that people from all across these different disciplines need good climate information, need community, need support. And so we'll support them all while we also work with other aligned societies to help them to do a better job of supporting their membership in the future.
Awesome. You sound like you've been at it for a while. What is your journey? How did you end up in that position, and not just the position at ASAP, but just adaptation and being so passionate and so interested and so focused on it?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I enjoy most about my own journey into this world is that I came to it through a human rights background, and my work has been actually more. So I work specifically in the domestic context now with ASAP, the U.S. domestic, but my background is working in first HIV/AIDS work in Africa, and then in sustainable community development. My master's degree is in planning and developing countries with a focus working in Africa. But it was really through a lot of my international work that I started to see that the systems that we are using are simply not sustainable. And this is where there's sort of a flipping a switch, in my view, from sustainability to adaptation, where we've talked for a long time about sustainability, but the reality is that the way that we're living and the systems that we have aren't sustainable. And so if we're going to actually have a future that is taking care of the people who are most vulnerable and the most at risk, it has got to adapt. We have to see something transformational happen. And I went from working in that international context to spending a number of years at the University of Michigan, where I had come into directing what was called the NOAA's National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration program on developing usable climate information to inform decision making across a number of sectors. And I really saw that, the academic community plays a huge role in the adaptation field and growing the field, there was a need for a professional society for people who are doing work on the ground to really think about how are we going to move things forward. And so I had a chance to jump over and to take over this position at ASAP, and it's been remarkably fulfilling for me. I really enjoy what I do. I enjoy the thrust of the job, which is connecting and supporting people that do adaptation work, and the people who do this work are so pragmatic, they're so optimistic, and they're so driven to actually affect change that getting to work for them and work with them it's a pleasure and it's an honor.
Yeah. Of course, the from what I read on the website, the organization began at the Dark Horse Saloon in Boulder, Colorado.
As most good things do. Yeah.
That's yeah. I mean that's true. But it sounds like a very colorful start. A group of guys getting together and kind of like connecting with the same passion and drive and inspiration that you just talked about right now. And so from that opening, though, that beginning to your coming into the team, how did that work out?
So I was definitely somebody who sat on the sidelines of ASAP for a while and told them what I thought they should be doing. And and so when they went to hire an executive director, I think there was some of, well, Beth, then why don't you do it? There's definitely some, as they say, putting your money where your mouth is, that I stepped into. And I'd had colleagues. I was an ASAP member myself. I had friends and colleagues who were part of um, the original member group of ASAP when it formed in that saloon in Boulder. And so when this job came open, it seemed like it was the opportunity for me to, as they say, put your money where your mouth is and actually and step into the role. And it's been, as I said, it's been an honor for me because I have friends and colleagues who have been in ASAP from its inception. I was a member of ASAP since I think 2013 probably, and and then to get to actually dig into my passion, which is about people. It's about connecting people and supporting people, and I've filled that kind of connecting and supporting role in so many of my jobs over my life, and to get to do this now for some of the folks who I think are the most driven and passionate and fun and really dedicated. The people that do adaptation work, if nothing else keeps you coming back day after day, it's the people, it's the colleagues, and they want to see action taken in a way that is pragmatic and, as I said, pragmatic, optimistic, and really, as I heard somebody say this week, adaptation isn't about getting ready for aliens to land. It's about accelerating the way that we already know how to prepare for climate change. Climate change in many places exacerbates our existing vulnerabilities. We know what to do. It's a matter of, are we going to do it well enough, fast enough, in enough places to actually take care of the people who are at risk. And the adaptation professionals that I work for, that I support, are the ones who are taking on that challenge and trying to make sure that we're actually answering this humanitarian, environmental, social, economic crisis that we're facing.
Absolutely. And there are a lot of places and a lot of folks who do not know what to do when disaster strikes. And so that's where you fill an even bigger role. So your website says you're up to 1,136 members in 47 states and 487 organizations. That's a pretty good number right there for the short time you've been around. But where are you going? And what's the goal? Again, when we look at those 25 sectors and those 16 verticals, and it's such a huge space, you have many more thousands to go. So how many more thousands do you want? Can you handle? Is there a number?
It's a good question. I answer this question quite a lot, actually, and I think that it's not a defined end at this point because of ASAP's role is twofold in the field. It's connecting and supporting people who do adaptation work, but it's also advancing innovation and excellence in the field. And one of the outcomes of our work when it's done well is that we create these other homes for adaptation professionals in other societies. That ASAP becomes both a home for people who are doing adaptation work, but also that we're helping what we call these aligned fields. It's the American Planning Associations, the planners, the architects, the engineers, that we are helping them to elevate and accelerate their own adaptation and resilience practices and standards in their fields. And when that's done well, it's conceivable that the number of ASAP members decreases because they have other homes where they can find good information in a strong community. So for ASAP, the question is less about how many members we have, but more about, are we actually reaching consistency in the field? Are we seeing standards emerging? Are we seeing a field of practice and an industry that somebody can come into and clearly understand what is adaptation, what is resilience, what is a good practice, who should I be going to? And when we've established those kinds of standards of practice, regardless of our membership numbers, that'll be a successful future for ASAP.
Great vision, great vision. Now, tell us a little bit about the programs that you have to enable that. So you have affinity groups, you offer webinars. Yeah. I was in the Resilience Dialogue webinar a couple of days ago. It was amazing, fantastic team and process. Your policy work, your communication work. Walk us through your day-to-day. What do you do? What does the organization do, really, on a day-to-day basis, or the platform you put together?
Yep. Yeah, and so when we think about that, again, it comes back to these two mission areas of connecting and supporting members. And so through that, we have our online website where people are able to go in, become members, enter their profile information, tag their interests, find others in the network that have shared interests that are from a similar region, and then they can start to see affinity groups. And these are member-led activities that reflect member interests. So policy, projects and evaluation, communication, and these groups meet at a regular interval with support from the ASAP staff. And some of them are what we would call generative groups, where they are developing a specific product. So we had a code of ethics working group, a group that said, the thing that we need to get to initially as a new field is a code of ethics. So they convened for 8 months, they wrote a code of ethics, and now it's been adopted. We have a policy committee, and the policy committee has generated material, but they also meet to convene to talk about what are the leading policy concerns in the domestic and the international arena. So these member-led activities really are genuinely that. They're an opportunity for members in the network to come to meet each other and to choose how they would like to be putting their energy forward, either to just convene or to actually generate something. We also support a number of more programmatic activities. The leading aspect of that is the Resilience Dialogues. And Resilience Dialogues is a program which was initiated under the Obama White House, and ASAP was a partner to that. And in the last year, we have become the lead private sector partner in the dialogues, and we're convening a number of other organizations. And the dialogues are it's an online discussion between subject matter experts and communities that have either low resources or are remote. And it's a week-long facilitated discussion, first framing what are the climate challenges in that community. So we bring a highly trained facilitator in, and they help to facilitate this online discussion. And we think of it as a way for communities with fewer resources to still have access to subject matter experts while they're able to stay in situ. So they're in their own community, they're at their desk, they can do their day-to-day while they also are getting this kind of workshop experience come to them. The first of those dialogues is about framing their challenge. The second dialogue is another week, which is about connecting them. And here again, this is really at the core of what ASAP does. Our job is not to actually serve resources, but it is to connect people with one another. So we help to get them over that first hump of saying, what is the challenge you're facing in regard to climate? And now here is the breadth of resources that are existing out there: federal resources, private resources, nonprofit resources, local and regional and national. And then to really be able to bring them into the system of service so that they're able to become a more resilient community. It's a really terrific program, and it's a great place for ASAP to operate because it is at the intersection of science with our subject matter experts and communities and facilitation. And I think it really embodies what we think of as the vision for the organization to connect and support people and also advance practice.
I could not agree more. In fact, again, I was at that webinar. When was it? A couple of days ago. And yeah, and the only, I mean, I walked away. I mean, my only thought was, it's too bad. I mean, right now from the question Q&A session and the reach, in other words, how many communities you're able to cover and help right now. And so basically 10, 15 at a time, which is, good number. I mean, better than fewer than, but still the need is so huge. And the dialogues, for all the reasons you just stated and were reviewed in the, or presented in the webinar are really magnificent. It's a magnificent vehicle. You're filling a space. Nobody else is doing this. But I'm just praying that you guys get to hundreds and maybe thousands of communities,
I know,
simultaneously, because God knows the world needs for you to have that reach. With the dialogues and other things.
As a small organization of how you prioritize that kind of work, because I've been in conversations most recently with WRI, World Resources International, or World Resources Institute, and the emerging Global Center on Climate Adaptation Excellence out of the Netherlands, and what can we be doing to export a model like Resilience Dialogues. But there's a tension because the US adaptation community is really underserved. And so for us to be exporting our programs internationally really requires us to look hard about what our mission is and what is our service area. As I articulated, have always a vision towards trying to bridge international and domestic programs. I think it's shameful how much, how much separation there is, especially in things like adaptation and disaster resilience work, and in so many fields between the U.S. domestic practice and the international practice. But it is really hard to decide whether or not organizationally we have the capacity to expand a program outside of the U.S. context.
In fact, that falls very nicely into one of the subjects I wanted to ask you about, which is a challenge of scale in adaptation and resilience. And it's exactly as you just said. I mean, most organizations, most companies, most government agencies have a certain regional or functional space they have to cover. They have only so many resources available. But then that kind of leaves, the challenge of scale underserved, right? And, in other words, adaptation there's such a huge need, and we need to move so much faster and cover so much more ground than the space is covering right now. So yeah, I mean, collaboration, it comes down to, well, you're setting up a model here between ASAP, the dialogues, the affinity groups, and maybe you don't have to serve Latin America or Asia, but maybe that can serve as a model that others can pick up, and maybe you can facilitate other ASAPs of the world, and maybe like a franchise idea, perhaps. So how do you, what is it that, or how is it that we can scale and get, which really comes down to getting more people, more governments, more companies, more NGOs, more communities to see the need, to become engaged, involved, and to adopt practices?
I think that we're at a point right now in adaptation action and climate action that we're at I genuinely think that we're at a tipping point. At least most of the world doesn't have a hard time accepting that climate change is real and that the impacts are already with us. As you know, the US obviously has a much harder time with this really basic acceptance for whatever reason that is. But 2017 was I believe a watershed for us. The number of disasters, the diversity of disasters, the places impacted, the way that communities were impacted has really forced a recognition that we cannot keep on trying to maintain the status quo without adapting. And I think that when we talk about scale, there's two questions to consider. There's scale and there's transferability. And what you mentioned was that ASAP maybe shouldn't be trying to scale resilience dialogues, but transfer it so that we have a model that can work someplace else and someplace else. Often I think scaling, the difference there with scaling is that you have a program that's working well in its one community, and so you're going to do the exact same thing every place else, and that's not going to work with adaptation. Adaptation is typically so local. It requires this regional or local climate information. It takes a careful look at community context. In order for this work to be done in a way that is actually equitable and ethical, it has to be patient. There has to be a process that you evaluate what is the local knowledge and need before implementing an action. And because of that, it's always going to require that activities are place-based. And I think the sooner we can accept that, the better it'll be for us to say that we can transfer a process, but you aren't going to be able to do a one-size-fits-all solution across 17 communities that seem the same because they're all rural and on a river. They're going to be different. And if you try to export the exact same thing to them, you're going to see more you're going to see more exploitation. You're going to see more of the same people who are already at risk continuing to be at risk. One potential solution, and this is going to sound funny given what I just said about equity, and especially some of the risks around equity, I think getting the business community to participate more wholly in the adaptation and resilience activities is a scaling mechanism, because the business community, you take a corporation and they have multiple facilities across multiple sites. They think about this in a global manner. They think about the network. They think about the supply chain. They have a intuition that has more of a kind of a global view than what you would than most people. Most people think about their single place where they are right now. It's where their house is, it's where they work, and that's that. But if you can actually get some of the corporate mentality of thinking about their supply chain and their whole considering solutions, then I think you start to have a real opportunity for scale and for action, because it's inherent in the way that they have to build solutions to other corporate resilience challenges.
That is an extremely important point that that very few folks in adaptation kind of get. In other words, there is this sector, these companies that do have that already in their operations inherently a scalable model or a scale mechanism there, that if that can be kind of transported or applied elsewhere, that would be great. That also throws us into a discussion of innovation. You mentioned earlier how that one of your roles is to encourage that innovation, to encourage that frontier thinking in terms of what's next. What is it that we're missing that we might need in resilience and adaptation. So what are some of the trends that you see happening now as you talk to your members that give you hope in terms of innovations in the pipeline that you just can't wait to be commercialized or applied?
One of my favorite examples that I've been talking about recently is actually in Detroit, Michigan, where you don't expect to see, well, I guess on one hand, it's like the home of innovation, but on the other hand, it certainly has taken some hits in the last few decades. There's an effort there where they have been installing remote sensors throughout the sewer system so that they can watch where water is moving through the system. There's a tremendous problem in Detroit and in many cities throughout the Northeast and the Midwest in the US where stormwater systems can't sustain the amount of water that's going through them during increasingly high precipitation events. And so they now are monitoring the system, and they've installed boons. So these kind of inflatable systems that when they realize that the part of the system is going to get overwrought, they can deploy the boons. They will blow up in 90 seconds. They'll block a tunnel, and they'll actually hold water back into one part of the system. And so it's this technology solution in a city where they don't have the money to actually do a major gray infrastructure update. Green infrastructure is fine, but green infrastructure only really solves for so much during a severe precipitation event. And now they're bringing this technology solution to actually use the infrastructure that's in place in a way that's smarter. So really smart remote sensing technology to curb these combined sewer overflows, to reduce the amount of negative impacts on the public health and so much else that is a result when you have those combined system overflows. So I think that's really neat.
That's
I
a
think
great
that
one.
remote sensing is we're just scratching the surface of it, and I think that you're going to see more and more of that kind of technology emerging. I know that there's other efforts that are happening in coastal communities with remote sensing to understand how, installing seawalls in one place will lead to overflows in other areas. And we have a lot of, I think this kind of, the way that we're going to use sensing and technology is really starting to explode and really starting to get explored in new and interesting ways.
Absolutely. How much thinking are you and your team and your members giving to the overwhelm natural disaster, the natural disaster that overwhelms adaptation, that say that sea level rise that's coming, that is expected to permanently flood airports and maritime ports and coastal areas, and then the greater frequency and intensity of these monster storms like Harvey and Irma and Maria and Katrina and Sandy, and to the extent or that we start getting a lot more of those, then many of our adaptation technologies and measures and practices will simply be overwhelmed by a lot of that. And, so, how much thinking is going on in the industry or in the space? Do you think in that direction, in dealing with not just a one-off like a Harvey happening or a Maria happening, and not happening again for 5 years or 10 years, but the really high probability that we're going to have these monster
It's not a
storms
100-year
and
storm
monster
anymore,
forest
right?
fires and monster flood events, right? So, yeah.
I think
But in terms
it's a
of the
balance.
mindset and the conversation going on, are you satisfied that there's enough conversation going on? Uh-huh.
It's a real balance, because if adaptation is reduced to disaster preparedness, then we've missed the point, because the impacts from climate change that are really insidious, the extended heat events and those combined sewer overflows that I was talking about, the people who are already at risk and already dying because of impacts from climate change, um, are at risk more often than when we just hear about headline events. And and so there's this balance of how do we make sure that we are thinking about adaptation as not just in reaction to the headline, but in preparation for the everyday change, the everyday climate change, which is occurring, in addition to thinking really critically about what does it mean that we have these more severe, those really punctuated events. And I would say that as a community, we are not doing the best thinking we could on how do we cope with and prepare for more regular, really severe, especially coastal storms. There's still I think, a desire, because there's a desire and a necessity. Our business, our economy is coastal. And this question of, are you going to move Miami, New York, Boston, New Orleans, Houston? Are you going to move these cities, or are you going to fortify them? And I think right now we're still really talking about fortifying. And that might not be borne out as the solution we should actually be moving toward. But retreat is a very, very scary thing to talk about. Economically, it is terrifying for investors to hear that discussed. And I don't think that anybody's actually ready to really talk about large scale retreat of major economic coastal centers. And I don't know when we will. I expect it'll be like it'll be a light switch that flips. Like one day there'll be a coastal investment and the next day there won't. And I don't know who holds that power. I have some theories about it, I guess. There'll be a time when that it's just not insurable to keep building on the coast. Yeah. But we're not there yet. And so until that insurance incentive goes away, it'll continue. That's a long way of answering your question, because there's much to do, and we have the space we're in right now, this tipping point that I think we're at, of people really waking up and saying climate change is real, it's happening, it's affecting me now, is leading to us seeing some really neat innovations. The emergence and the recognition of the leadership of the business sector and the private sector, discussions with insurance, with reinsurance, that all is really positive. But at the same time, there's still a lot of communities that are really back here at the 101 who are saying, I'm using old engineering data to anticipate my next storm. What do I do different? And we have got to make sure that we're like bringing them along too. So it takes a real diversity of action to move forward.
It's quite an agenda you have on your hands. And so on that note, we thank you again for joining us and being part of this conversation. And it'll be the first of many, I suspect, because we have a lot of things to continue talking about and bringing up and bring some other people into the conversation. And at some point, it'd be great to have one of these talks with a couple of folks right there next to you, or maybe joining us in the call and having and just digging deeper into some of the things that we kind of like superficialized today. So thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Alex. It's a pleasure to talk with you.